Document control is critical to your organization, but it can also be such a drain on resources, speed, flexibility, motivation. So let's discuss lean document control that is still compliant with standards. Hello, I'm Tom. Welcome to my channel where we discuss how to make operational excellence work for your organization. And today I'll be going into a question basically posed by Jimmy Wong on could you please describe QMS, so Quality Management System, document control? And yes, of course. Now, that is a very broad question. So I picked, I think, the most important topic that is in relation to operational excellence, to lean, continuous improvement, and that is how do we make it work for the business? Because it should serve you and it should serve your operation. Right? And that is what you need to focus on. Whatever quality management system you put in place, and you know, right, quality management systems are not just about the product quality or a very narrow definition of the quality department. This is how do we manage the quality of our processes and products in a broader sense. So basically, it's your management system. It's your running the operation. What we see is that our operations, they are built up out of processes. But those processes, they tend to have a bit of a hierarchy. Now, what I drew here, it's not 100% process, right? That was not the idea. But to get a bit of an idea of how these are usually sort of organized. So we've got our typical departments, like processing, mixing, filling, shipping. They do the work for your product flow. And they are usually sort of organized into departments or into vice presidents or something like that, right? There's a bit of a grouping of work areas. For instance, we've got a production that encompasses the processing and mixing part, and we've got an expedition that encompasses that filling and shipping. And then those, so the site, the factory, they also tend to have a bunch of support departments. And here we see a common pitfall, and that's why I want to dive into that, because there is a difference in how these support functions work. For instance, if we take the lab, the laboratory, which is part of the quality team usually, so I could also put quality here somewhere, but specifically the lab, they take in samples, they do analyses, they document results, and they bring it back to wherever in the operation it was needed. That by itself is an operation, right? So the lab is not your core process, but the laboratory with all of the analyzing and the people there, that is an operation in itself as well. So treat that as specifically that part, as a part that also needs its own work instructions, its own documentation, record keeping, stuff like that. The safety department, however, generally does not really have its own operation. Maybe if you're huge, you have a safety department that is so big that they really need their own operational management and control, but generally something like a safety department, but also a QA and even more generally a QC department, they will be making decisions, supporting, setting up systems for the rest of the organization. And that is very important because we need to be thinking about people doing a job. And that is the main thing I want you to take from this picture. People doing a job, they need to be able to reference to your quality management system. So if I am a team leader in mixing, then I need a bunch of instructions, records, and all that stuff about mixing. And also the stuff that is in production or in the larger factory. But I have certain safety rules to abide by that are factory-wide or very specific to mixing. But I don't want a separate safety instruction. Right? So safety should not become its own sort of set of documentations. Incorporate it into which processes I'm doing. I will not be working on the safety process. I will be working on production processes, or specifically today I'm in a mixing process. Since I'm a team leader, I will also have management of my people processes, that is a factory thing. Right? And a safety audit, that is not a safety thing, that is a factory-wide operational system. Just like our HR systems, just like general quality assessments, quality policies, they are defined, linked to an operational level. So they are either factory-wide, very specific to mixing, very specific to the laboratory. There's absolutely specific safety rules when working in the laboratory that don't really count for the rest there. So in the work instruction for your laboratory, that's where you put those safety things. Thinking in the process of doing the work and making sure that most of the support functions, that they also work in the rest of the process. Now, maintenance is also one of those double ones, right? Maintenance, the team, especially the maintenance engineers, they tend to make a lot of standards and help for the operation. But in the maintenance department, you also tend to have a group of technicians, a workshop, spare part management. So there is a double thing, right? Maintenance decides things for other operations, and they also have their own, like a lab, right? They have their own spare part management and their own working. So they do have maintenance documents. But how do we inspect the mixing thing? It depends on who's going to do that. If we make a work instruction for operators doing inspections on the mixing line, that is going to be a mixing document. If we make an instruction for a specific technician in the maintenance team to do a periodic inspection of the mixing lines, that is going to be a maintenance team document because it is meant for the people in the maintenance department. And yes, that very well may mean, because most companies do both, that the inspection of a mixing line is split over two documents because your people and your processes are organized in a specific way. So follow your people, not your department names. Now, when we look at the documentation that you have in your quality management system, there is a hierarchy, and in the older systems there's quite an extensive hierarchy. When we want to keep our document management and our quality management system a bit manageable, we'll need to reduce that. The less you really put into your quality management system in structures and binding rules, the better. Because all of that needs to be done then by your operation. So the more you specify very specific terms, criteria linked to how you manage management systems, how you management documentation, the more difficult it will be for your operation to move forward and improve. So we will define just the minimum levels. And even here, I can already spoil that I've added one level, sort of too many probably, but it depends a bit on your preferences. So what we have. We have policies, processes, instructions, and records. Now, what do these mean? A policy, that is a general sort of steering and strategy setting document. It does not really go into how specifically do we do things. It goes into what do we want to achieve and sort of the why, right? General rules, values to live by, general strategic directions. Within policy, you probably also have your main KPIs, and it is important to note, but we'll get back to that a bit, policy can be made on all of these levels, right? So policy is not only for the whole factory. Then process, and this is the one that I would say is even optional as a documentation hierarchy category. You can also put the process into policy or organize instructions by processes. But in general, I see that it is easier for the readability of your quality documentation, but also for understanding by everybody, right? Auditors, but also your own people in the organization, if you really define your processes in a good way, probably even a bit of a hierarchical way, right? Overall process overview and then a bit more specific process maps. Then we've got instructions. Now, If you go for the bit older standards, here somewhere you will have a manual and procedures. Now luckily the 2015 revision of ISO removed the need for a manual, but your company might very well still have that. The manual is mainly how do we work with documentation and with setting all of this up. How do we refer to things when we talk about quality and performance and documentation and management? So basically, it's instructions on the factory level of how do we do document management. Anyone who does document management will have to read them. It's instructions on how do we do KPI reviews. Anyone who has a management position and is in KPI things needs to know that. So instead of making it a separate manual part in the hierarchy, consider it to be a bit of policy maybe, but mostly instructions on a pretty high process level. And then there's procedures. So procedures, they are like a high level instruction sort of document. So they first say roughly what will be done. And then you have instructions saying, how do you do that? Put it into the instructions with a process ordering and you'll be fine. So that's why I think those can go. Also very important why you want them to go is because the people in your organization that are not diehard quality specialists, they will not understand the difference between a policy and an instruction. And if you do something similar when you say we have a difference in SOP, so standard operating procedure, work instruction, and 1-point lesson, and video course, or safety instruction, they are all a form of instruction. But if you call them different names in your documentation system and in your quality management system, you're just asking for people to make mistakes. So don't, right? Do not make that extra layer that is not really needed. The layer that you will need, and this one is a bit tricky because usually the form that makes a record is part of the instruction and the record is the filled in thing. So what is a record for those not all too deep in quality management? If we say that we have a checklist, right? And we check whether or not the cleaning was done every 2 hours, and there's checks and there's a signature of the operator or the cleaner or the warehouse employee, whoever does that cleaning part. This form of who needs to clean, where, how often, which tools is usually on there, but can be in the instruction. But this form sort of gives a bit of an instruction by itself. If you make a good form, but then when you print that thing out, or you have it digitally, but when you then fill in that printed out form, and there are the actual checks and the signature and the spot check and whatever are on there, that is a record. A record is proof of having done your work, your process according to an instruction. And that you generally need to save, at least for some time. Right? For each record you determine how long it needs to be saved, but usually you need to do something with those records. So the form that will become a record is still part of the instruction, generally as an appendix, but the records, they do need to be stored somewhere. This means that we basically have only 3 sort of documents that we really keep in the manual side, right? In the this is what we manage side. Records are in the archive. So what can we do with these? We need to know who is responsible for them, who makes them, who should be okay with them. Why? Well, not just because the certification party wants to do that, but because they are all linked to our processes and to our management system. So if you are the manager of the production department, well, most likely many of the instructions and even the policy for the production department should be okayed by you. But you're also almost guaranteed to be working in some sort of matrix organization responsibility-wise, where the safety team, the quality team, the maintenance team, the HR team, they also have something to say about your instructions. And here we get into another very easy pitfall, which is if you have any safety part in your document, then does any revision somewhere in that document means it needs to be reaffirmed by safety or not? I know that you might want to say technically yes, but here it's important to define some mandates as well. To say, look, we're going to give, for instance, team leaders, production specialists, we're going to give you the mandate to say, I did a change in the work instruction for mixing line 2, and that change, in my best experience and opinion, did not influence product quality or safety. So this change does not need to be rectified by the quality and safety teams. It can just be under the team leader's responsibility. Is that a bit scary? Do you now in the quality team feel like, oh, we're losing control over our documentation? Yeah, probably. But this is what you need to have a good, continuously improving operation. Because the alternative, if for every change that they do, people always need to get signatures of 5 directors, then they are going to make all of those changes outside of your nicely managed quality management system. So your QMS will no longer reflect the reality of what happens on the factory floor. And that is way, way worse. So make sure your people are trained, right? So they're competent in knowing that how they can spot risks and what they do to processes, but then get the autonomy and the authority to really make the choice of this is a good change. And also to, when they do think that it might have safety impact, that they, in that case, do escalate to a safety change committee, for instance. So that is an important part if you want a learning and autonomous organization to build that in. That unified instruction can have a bunch of addendums, right? A bunch of extra attachments to it, like, for instance, which forms do we fill in? But also, under this, we will have our OPLs, our one-point lessons. For more detail on that, see my video on how you organize work instructions specifically. But the whole idea here is, if you change a document, this actually goes for policies and processes and records as well. If you change something, then you'll need to show that to anyone who uses that document, right? But instead of just saying, here's the updated version of our work instruction, it's better to say, here's the updated version of the work instruction, and have this one-point lesson. The one point that we changed is specifically, we are no longer using the emergency stop. We now installed a nice button to shut down the machine when changing out your papers, right? So yes, the emergency stops will stay, but not as a way to shut down the machine anymore. And you explain why you made this change. That's the one-point lesson. That one goes in as sort of an attachment until you have revised the instruction, which you do maybe as soon as you make the OPL. Then it doesn't even need to become a attachment, which makes your document management easier. But it means you have to update the instructions formally a bit more often, or you do that in a revision cycle. And now that we are on the point of that, right? I already said you need people who are responsible. You need to think about how often do you revise these documents. That is sort of the 3 R's that you need for your documentation management, your document control. We have our responsible, revision, and retention. And what that means is you need to know who is responsible for all of these documents, because they need to approve when you make changes. That's what we've been discussing. Try to keep that at a relatively low level, right? The production manager generally has the right to sign instead of one of their team leaders, right? So if you say that for basic changes to the daily operation of our mixing line, team leaders have the authority to okay documents, maybe after a small procedure, right? After they have an okay of all the other team leaders. But that grants you a lot of flexibility and speed in updating operational procedures. And you can still, as production manager, say, okay, well, maybe team leader John is not in this week, but I have reviewed the documentation, also know what I'm doing, and yes, I will sign instead of the usual team leader. If you say it always has to be the factory director, well, it's not so common that a production manager or a team leader can sign instead of the factory manager. So you see that, put it at the lowest level that you still trust to really make good judgments. Now, of course, as we also said, there are sub-responsibilities, right? So when we do a safety change, well, a change that will affect sort of your safety risks, your safety procedures, probably somebody in the safety team needs to co-sign. When it affects product quality or has the risk of affecting product quality, probably somebody in the quality assurance team has to co-sign. So there are co-signs, but try to organize it in such a way that this is at the judgment of the main responsible person, whether or not these need to also be informed, or actually they need to sign specifically. They'll always need to be informed, but they need to sign specifically for a change. When the document is created, always, all the co-signees also, because things have been put down that are also on their field. But revisions, not always. Now that we're on revisions, how often do you check and revise your policies, your instructions? Anytime you change the actual work that you do, please also change those instructions. And as I said, right, you can do this in a sort of a two-tier where you always do make the OPLs, but make the OPLs and only later do the revision, like a yearly cycle, or you can do it immediately when you do the change. If your procedures around changing documents are easy enough, team leader or process engineer level is allowed to actually make changes, then go for directly updating documents, right? Then you don't need to save the OPL, at least not very long. The same actually goes for processes and policies as well. When things change, please update those documents. When the management team decide to give a slightly different strategic direction, don't be afraid to update the business policy of 2025, right? If in July 25 you change a bit your strategic direction, you give a specific priority, change the policy document, because this is the new policy that goes into your organization. But what if you do not make any changes? Well, it is very good practice to still have a revision date on there, or at least a revision term, right? So you say every year or 2 years, those are sort of the two logical terms. That's your range, right? If you say every 18 months, also fine. But from a year to about 2 years, that is a good term to say, even if we didn't really change anything, or we think we didn't change anything, I want somebody who's responsible for that process to go through the document, just to check that everything is still correct. Quite likely, this can be a rubber stamping exercise, but we do want you to really see if it is still a good document for us. And then there is retention. Retention of documents, it tends to come into play mainly with your records. And for those, you really need to define it. Absolutely, any record, you need to define how long are we going to keep it. And if they're electronic or managed by an archiving team, then absolutely write into the instructions also that they are thrown away after the retention time, because you don't want to clutter everything with unneeded records. And you don't know what people are going to find in those records after you stop managing them. But also for instructions, processes, policies, well, if you want to have a management review on did we achieve last year's policy, you will need a policy document, right? So if you have a system where revisions are simply saved, That's okay, but how long do you retain a previous revision? Give it a bit of thought. These are not the most critical, but it is good practice to also here say, well, we should at least always retain 2 previous versions. That's a good way. It's not time bound. You just say the previous 2 versions will be retained. Or you say any previous version will be retained for at least 18 months, or it depends on the document. But do decide something on it. That way you can manage how you use the documents for your quality management system. That is linked to your actual process, that supports your operation. Now, we can of course also deeply go into how do we in practice organize it in our electronic systems, in our paper systems. This video is going to be way too long. It's already long as it is, way too long for that. If that also interests you, let me know and we'll make a follow-up video on it. But I wanted to just share these basic, super important principles. Make sure that your whole quality management system, and therefore also the documents, that they serve your operational system, your processes, and that they first of all serve that same operational hierarchy. Then you have your document hierarchy that needs to be as flat as possible. You have policy things, they don't really tell you how to do it, just what are the goals. And they tend to change a bit less frequently, but they're definitely not as detailed. Policy documents. Describe your process. Maybe this even comes first, but depends a bit on what you want. But because you organize everything according to your processes, it's good to have it in. But this, if anything is optional, this one's optional. Then you have all kinds of instructions to specifically tell you how to do certain processes, certain work, certain whatever, right? They have some attachments like maybe OPLs, but also like maybe the forms that will become the records, or the attachment can even be, and we didn't discuss that, but the table of setting values, typical attachments to an instruction as well, because you organize instructions according to these processes as well. And then you need to keep many records where you need to prove what did we produce, what were the quality checks, did we meet our KPIs and policy targets, all kinds of things, did we do our cleanings and our tasks. We keep records for them, and especially for the records we really need to know how long we're going to keep them. Basically for all of these documents we want to know who can okay changes to them, how often do we check even if we think that probably nothing changed, and how long are we going to keep previous versions. If you set this up in a way that links to your operation and you put the responsibilities as low in the organization as you can get away with, then you set yourself up for a flexible quality management system that moves with the improvements that your operation really makes, but still will completely be certifiable as a good quality management system. In fact, a good auditor will like this system and praise you for it. Unfortunately, there's a couple of stick to the rules auditors also who just want to prove that you don't do what you say. Don't let them ruin your operation. If you like this overview, please let me know through that like button. And I am very sure that this triggered more questions. Ask them in the comments. I love your questions and your suggestions for videos. And for now, I wish you the best of luck setting up and managing your quality management system. But as always, don't forget to also enjoy the operational excellence journey.